Imagine lying in a small wooden hut, surrounded by damp stone walls and the scent of burning herbs. Your breath is shallow, your skin hot to the touch, and a pounding ache presses behind your eyes. Outside, chickens cluck near the muddy path. Inside, a man with blood-stained hands sharpens a knife beside a bowl of leeches. You're not in a horror story. You're in a medieval clinic. And this man? He's your doctor. This is the world of medieval medicine, a world where science and superstition walked hand in hand, where every fever was a punishment from God, and where treatment often meant something far worse than the illness itself. People didn't just fear death in those days. They feared the healer just as much, because back then healing could hurt badly. For most people today, getting sick means heading to a hospital or taking over-the-counter medicine. We rarely think twice about antibiotics or painkillers. But centuries ago, things weren't that simple. You didn't have aspirin or antiseptics. Instead, you had boiling oil poured into wounds, holes drilled into skulls, and mysterious powders made from crushed bones and insects. That's if you could even afford a physician. More often than not, your local barber would be the one pulling your teeth, lancing your boils, or even amputating your limbs. But how did medicine get this dark? Why did people trust these gruesome cures? And who were the ones behind them? The answer lies buried in a time when sickness was seen not as biology, but as punishment, a divine warning or demonic possession. And yet, through the fog of fear and misinformation, real attempts at healing still emerged. Strange as they seem now, many of these practices were rooted in observation, trial, and sometimes even surprising logic. Let's step into the past. Not the glittering castles or knightly tales you often hear, but the muddy villages and smoky huts where most people actually lived. This story isn't about kings and wars. It's about everyday people. Farmers, midwives, traveling healers. It's about what they believed, how they survived, and how their strange remedies shaped the roots of modern medicine. Take, for example, the case of Father Edmund. He wasn't a doctor by trade. He was a parish priest in a tiny English village tucked deep in the woods. His parishioners came to him with every kind of trouble, spiritual, emotional, and physical. And like many clergymen of the time, Edmund doubled as the town's healer. He kept a dusty leather-bound book filled with remedies passed down through generations. Some involved herbs like sage and yarrow. Others were less comforting. To treat evil spirits of the brain, one recipe called for the ashes of a crow mixed into wine. Edmund followed the book with faith, never questioning whether it truly worked. In his eyes, sickness was not just physical, it was moral. Healing the body meant healing the soul. Then there was Ansel, a traveling bone setter known across villages for his ability to fix what God broke. People with twisted limbs, broken arms, or dislocated shoulders sought him out. His methods were crude but effective. He didn't use anesthesia, just strong hands, fast movements, and maybe a swig of mead to dull the pain. Ansel had no formal training, but he'd learned from watching animals, mimicking how wolves treated their wounded packmates. He believed in instinct, and in a world without hospitals, he was often the best chance anyone had. But not all healers were welcomed. Some were feared, especially women. Agnes, an old widow with a sharp tongue and a deeper knowledge of plants than most scholars, lived on the edge of her village. People whispered that she could cure anything, fevers, nightmares, even infertility. She never explained how. She just gave you a bundle of herbs and told you what to drink, when to sleep, and who to avoid. Many swore she saved their lives. Others said she was cursed. Eventually, when a child in the village died of pox, the blame fell on her. And as was often the case in medieval times, being a healer didn't protect you from fear or superstition. It made you a target. And yet, for all its pain and peril, medieval medicine wasn't just about horror. It was about resilience. People didn't give up. They experimented. They shared knowledge through generations, passed in whispered words and scratched notes. Some ideas, like washing wounds or using honey as an antiseptic, actually worked, even if no one yet knew why. Still, things could go horribly wrong. One of the most terrifying procedures of the time was trepanation, the act of drilling a hole into the skull to release what people believed were bad humors or demons. It sounds barbaric now, but some survived. Some even claimed their headaches stopped. Whether that was luck or something more, no one knew. But the image of a surgeon, barefoot, using a rusted tool to carve into a living skull, stays with you. Then there was the bloodletting. Oh, the bloodletting. Nearly every illness, from headaches to fevers to the plague itself, was treated by removing blood. Doctors believed the human body had 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If they weren't balanced, you got sick. And the easiest way to rebalance the body? Get rid of the excess. Blood was usually the first to go. Leeches were applied, veins were cut open, and sometimes cups were heated and placed on the skin to draw the blood to the surface. People fainted. People died. But the theory continued for centuries. Even the wealthy weren't spared. In fact, the nobility often suffered more due to overtreatment. Queen Isabella of France once reportedly endured a cure involving crushed pearls and gold leaf, ground into a drink so expensive only a royal could afford it. Whether it helped her or not is unknown, but it's a reminder that even status couldn't protect you from ignorance. Hospitals, such as they were, looked nothing like today's clean corridors. Monasteries ran most of them. The monks believed caring for the sick was part of their duty to God. But resources were scarce, beds were packed, and infections ran wild. There were no sterile tools, no antibiotics. A single infected wound could kill a dozen more. And yet, people kept coming. Because what else was there? Through it all, the line between healer and charlatan blurred constantly. Snake oil salesmen, or their medieval equivalent, roamed the countryside offering potions made from everything from crushed beetles to dog urine. Some genuinely believed in their cures. Others preyed on desperation. And in a world with no regulation, who could tell the difference? But not all stories ended in misery. In Italy, the city of Salerno birthed one of the first medical schools, where Arab, Jewish, and Christian scholars share their knowledge. Translations of ancient Greek and Roman texts began to resurface. Slowly, quietly, medicine started to shift. Practices based on observation began replacing rituals based on fear. Change is coming slow, uneven, but real. Still, for most villagers, that change was centuries away. Back in Father Edmund's village, a storm gathered on the horizon. A child had fallen ill with fever. The symptoms were strange: dark splotches on the skin, bleeding gums, and a high, relentless heat. The villagers whispered a word they hadn't spoken in years. Plague. Edmund, now older and tired, lit a candle in the church and opened his book of remedies. But even he hesitated. Deep down, he knew that if this sickness was what he feared, no herb or prayer would stop it. Outside, Ansel arrived with his cart, hearing of the child's illness. He brought his tools, his instincts, and a face weathered by years of seeing more suffering than he could count. He looked at the boy, then at Edmund. Their eyes met. No words were spoken, because both men knew the truth. Something old, something deadly, had returned. And this time, they weren't sure if any of their ancient cures would be enough. But someone, far from the village, someone who'd been collecting strange texts and secret cures hidden from the church, had started making their way toward them. A woman with a scar across her cheek and a bag full of forbidden scrolls. She was coming. But would she arrive in time? Or would this village become just another forgotten name on a long list of places lost to the darkness? That's what we're about to find out. But to understand what happens next, you'll need to understand what came before. Because the story of medieval medicine isn't just about sickness, it's about survival, about fear, about hope in the most hopeless places. And it's far from over. The wind howled as the woman rode through the narrow forest path, her hood pulled low and her face damp from the rain. Every bump in the road jostled the jars and bundles in her satchel, dried roots, aged manuscripts, small glass bottles filled with dark liquid. Her name was Isolde. To some, she was a healer. To others, a heretic. She didn't belong to any one village, any one church, or even any one set of beliefs. She had learned from wandering monks, Moorish traders, old hedge witches, and dusty scrolls written in languages most priests refused to read. Her knowledge was strange, ancient, and dangerous. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the child. Isolde had heard whispers in the last town, murmurs of a strange illness sweeping through the village beyond the woods. The symptoms were familiar. Too familiar. Spots, fever, bleeding, panic. She'd seen it before. Twice. And both times, it had nearly wiped out entire communities. Once, she managed to slow it down, not with magic but with knowledge. Isolation, clean water, burn bedding, charcoal and vinegar. But people didn't want to hear that. They wanted miracles. And when miracles failed, they wanted someone to blame. She pushed her horse harder. In the village, the air had turned heavy. People kept their doors shut, and the usual sounds, laughter, dogs barking, the clang of metal, had gone silent. Smoke drifted from only a few chimneys. Father Edmund moved slowly between homes, offering prayers and lighting incense. He had treated dozens of coughs, fevers, and wounds in his ears, but nothing like this. The boy, Thomas, had worsened overnight. His skin was nearly purple in places, and dark blood dripped from his nose. His mother hadn't slept in 2 days, holding him close, whispering songs from his cradle years. But nothing brought his fever down. Ansel had done what he could, cut a vein to relieve the pressure, packed the boy in cold rags, offered willow bark to dull the pain. But he too had begun to doubt. This sickness didn't follow rules. It came too fast, spread too easily, and it didn't respond to anything they knew. By nightfall, the boy stopped responding. That same evening, Isolde arrived. She didn't knock. She walked into the chapel, soaked to the bone, her boots caked in mud. Edmund looked up from the altar, startled. They hadn't seen each other in years. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing toward the door. "I heard about the child," she said, brushing rain from her cloak. "And I came anyway." Edmund hesitated. Then he nodded. Within minutes, she was at the boy's side. The room stank of sweat, fear, and old linen. Isolde asked no questions. She examined the bruises, the pupils, the gums. She smelled the boy's breath, then burned a bit of rosemary in the corner. The mother looked at her with wide eyes, unsure whether to trust this stranger with wild eyes and a scar like a crack across her face. "Move him near the fire," Isolde said softly, "and keep everyone else out, especially the children." The mother obeyed, still silent. Edmund and Ansel watched from the doorway. Ansel finally asked, "You've seen this before?" Isolde nodded. "Twice." "Did they survive?" Edmund asked. "Some," she replied. "The ones who were treated early. The ones who weren't surrounded by others." Ansel frowned. "You're saying it spreads?" "I'm saying it moves fast. And if you don't shut this village down now, no one will be left to bury the dead." It was a harsh truth, but they knew she was right. That night, the village bell rang, not for prayer, but for warning. Edmund ordered all gatherings to stop. The market was closed. Houses were instructed to stay locked. Those with symptoms were to be isolated. It was chaos, and many resisted. But fear moves people faster than reason. Isolde stayed with the boy and gave him a dark mixture to ease the fever. She crushed charcoal into a paste and smeared it on cloth to bind his wrists and ankles. It looked strange, even frightening, but she explained it simply. The charcoal could absorb poisons. Whether it would help this time, she didn't know, but she had seen it make a difference before. Meanwhile, Ansel helped move the sick to the edge of the village, where old sheds became makeshift wards. He hated doing it. These were friends, neighbors, but he trusted Isolde's urgency. Over the next 2 days, 5 more children fell ill, then 2 adults. Panic grew like mold, silent, fast, and impossible to ignore. Rumors spread that the devil had cursed them, that someone in the village had brought this on them, that the old woman in the woods, long dead, had returned. Edmund did his best to calm them. He reminded them of mercy, of strength, of staying together. But fear frayed even the strongest bonds. And through it all, Isolde worked. She didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. She boiled herbs, washed linens in vinegar, and demanded that the sick not be touched without gloves soaked in wine or brine. She taught villagers how to make simple face coverings, cloths soaked in rosewater and sage. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. Some refused to listen. One family, convinced they were protected by prayer alone, kept their sick daughter hidden. Within 2 days, the entire household was infected. 2 died before sundown. Still, there were small victories. The boy, Thomas, survived the 3rd night. His fever broke just before dawn, and his mother wept quietly, holding his thin hand. No one cheered, but the silence that followed felt different. Not hollow, but waiting. Isolde remained calm, but Edmund could see her concern growing. Each day she walked the edge of the woods, gathering bark and herbs, muttering to herself. On the 4th night, she took Edmund aside. "This isn't the same as before," she said. "It's faster, stronger, or maybe I'm just slower now. You've done more than anyone else could. That doesn't mean it will be enough." Edmund looked at her. "Then what do we do?" Isolde hesitated. "There's a text, locked in a monastery library near the sea. It said to hold remedies brought from the east, cures even the Roman physicians fear to speak of. I tried once to see it, was turned away, but it may have something we've missed. You can't leave now. I might have to, but I won't go unless I know there's someone here who can hold the line." Edmund didn't respond right away, but the look in his eyes gave her the answer she needed. That night, as the moon rose behind thin clouds, a new sound echoed across the village. Hooves. More travelers, perhaps. Or worse, someone fleeing another infected town. Isolde stepped into the road, hand on her satchel, eyes scanning the dark trees. She didn't see the riders right away, but when they appeared, something inside her went cold. Their cloaks were clean, their boots polished. They rode in formation, not like merchants, but soldiers. At their head rode a man in priest's robes, bearing a silver cross and a sealed letter. He looked at Isolde with narrowed eyes, and then he said, "You're the one they call the Witch of Norwin, aren't you?" She didn't answer. "By order of the bishop," he continued, "you're to come with us immediately. Your presence here has been noted as a danger to public order." Behind him, the villagers had started to gather, whispering, watching. Edmund stepped forward. "She saved our lives. She's broken church law," the priest replied, "using forbidden texts, teaching heathen remedies. You all know the consequences of harboring such a person." Ansel tightened his grip on his walking stick. The boy's mother stepped in front of her door. Isolde didn't move. Her satchel hung heavy at her side, and her eyes, tired but sharp, looked straight through the man. "You're too late," she said. "It's already here." And with that, the storm that had been building, of sickness, of secrets, of fear and power, finally cracked open. What happens next may change the village forever. But that's for the next part of the story. The priest's expression tightened. Behind him, his riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. They hadn't expected resistance from such a small, forgotten place. But there it was, a woman with strange knowledge, a community on the brink, and a storm of sickness waiting spread. Still, the church didn't care about panic. They cared about order. And in their eyes, Isolde represented disorder in its purest form. "Step forward," the priest ordered again, this time louder. "This is your final warning. If you come willingly, no one else will suffer the consequences." The villagers froze. No one stepped in. Not yet. Then, quietly, the boy's mother walked out into the street. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "You said she's a danger, but my son is alive because of her." "That child was touched by dark forces," the priest said. "The illness itself may be a curse, brought on by unnatural healing. We cannot allow such practices to continue." "She boiled water," the woman replied. "She cleaned his wounds. She taught us how to stop the spread. If that's unnatural, then maybe we've been waiting for the wrong kind of miracle." The priest opened his mouth, but before he could speak again, another villager stepped forward. Then another. Soon, a loose circle had formed around Isolde, not as a mob, but as a wall. Edmund stepped beside her. "She hasn't broken any laws," he said calmly. "At least not here. She came when others turned their backs. She stayed when she could have fled. If your interest is in saving lives, then help us. If not, ride on." For a moment, Silence hung in the air like smoke. The horses pawed the muddy ground. The priest's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Then, with a sharp tug of the reins, he turned his horse. The others followed, and the group rode off into the misty dark without another word. They didn't head back toward the city. They took the road east toward the sea. Isolde watched them until they disappeared among the trees. She knew what it meant. They weren't gone. They were regrouping, sending word, or worse, gathering evidence. But there was no time to waste. Inside the chapel that night, the sick groaned softly, tucked beneath blankets soaked in herbal water. Isolde moved between them, checking pulses, applying compresses, whispering encouragement. Edmund and Ansel worked beside her, learning as they went. They had no idea how much longer they could hold the line. But they had hope, and that, for now, was enough. At sunrise, the worst happened. One of the stable hands, a strong boy of 19, collapsed near the well. His lips were blue, his breath shallow. He'd been showing no symptoms the day before. Now he was too weak to stand. Isolde had him carried inside immediately. This sickness was moving faster than it should. It wasn't just plague anymore. There was something strange about the way it traveled, not just from breath or touch, but through water, through damp wood, through something deeper. It was almost as if the land itself was holding the illness, rotting from within. "Something's wrong," Isolde said, wiping her hands on her apron. Ansel, exhausted, leaned against the wall. "You think it's in a well?" "I think it's in everything," she replied quietly. That evening, as Edmund prepared to speak to the villagers, a group of strangers arrived. 3 riders dressed in long dark cloaks, each with a symbol burned into their shoulder, a sunburst pierced by a sword. Isolde recognized it instantly. The Order of St. Dunstan, a secretive sect once charged with preserving divine health across the countryside. They were neither priests nor doctors. They were watchers, enforcers, and if they were here, it meant things had escalated. The lead rider dismounted and approached Edmund. "We've heard troubling reports," he said, "not just about sickness, but about unnatural remedies. We're here to observe, and if necessary, to act." Edmund stood firm. "You're welcome to observe, but you'll act only if I say so." The man raised a brow. "We don't answer to you." Isolde stepped forward, not bothering with pleasantries. "You want to help? Then help. Boil water. Clean linens. Pray if you must. But don't get in the way." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Not respect. Not yet. But curiosity. They stayed. Days passed. Some recovered. Some didn't. But slowly, the village began to change. People spoke more softly, moved more carefully. They listened to instructions. They washed. They covered their faces when tending to the sick. They started noticing things they'd ignored before. The smell of mold in their homes, the way water turned cloudy after a heavy rain, the tiny signs of decay that once blended into everyday life. Still, the sickness burned on. One evening, Isolde sat in the chapel's corner, reading from a water-damaged scroll. Edmund watched her from across the room, and after a moment he asked, "Do you ever wonder if this is all too much?" She didn't look up. "Every day." "Then why do you keep going?" Isolde finally looked at him. "Because someone has to, and because if I stop, then everything I've learned dies with me." Outside, a storm rolled in. Thunder echoed across the hills, and lightning cracked against the sky like God himself was angry. That same night, the stable boy died. He was the first to die under Isolde's care. No amount of herbs, steam, or prayer could save him. His family, grieving and frightened, buried him before dawn. But in their silence, there was no blame, only sadness. But the watchers saw weakness in the moment. The leader of the Order of St. Dunstan confronted Isolde behind the chapel, his voice cold. "You claim to know more than the church, more than our healers. But you couldn't save him." "I never claimed to know everything," she replied. "Only enough to try." He stepped closer. "What if trying isn't enough?" She didn't flinch. "Then you can watch the rest die. Or you can help me stop it." That night, the man left her a scroll, a banned document, taken from an old monastery, full of treatments thought too risky or strange for public use. It described early forms of quarantine, recipes using ingredients long abandoned. a theory that some sicknesses came not from sin, but from tiny invisible creatures that moved from host to host. Isolde read it by candlelight until her eyes ached. And then she saw it, a remedy she hadn't tried. A blend of ash, vinegar, crushed cedar resin, and powdered sulfur. Dangerous in high doses. But, if measured carefully, it had stopped an outbreak in a mountain town hundreds of miles away. A town that vanished from records soon after. The final note read, Asterisk. Only the desperate would try this. Asterisk. She looked around the room, saw the sleeping sick, heard their faint, ragged breathing. They were desperate, and so was she. At sunrise, Isolde stood before Edmund and Ansel with the scroll in her hands. I found something, she said, but we need supplies. Some from the woods, some from the caves near the old quarry. Then we'll go, Ansel said. Edmund hesitated. What if it doesn't work? Isolde looked him in the eye. Then we keep trying, until there's no one left to try for. And so, as the village held its breath and the storm passed overhead, a new kind of hope took root. Fragile, flickering, but real. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a second group of riders had left the city, armed, silent, and carrying fire. Their mission wasn't to heal. It was to cleanse. The village had one chance, and the clock had already started ticking. The sun never fully rose that day. A pale, gray light hovered over the village like a veil. Everything felt still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin tighten. Isolde stood at the edge of the woods, scanning the overgrown trail that would lead her to the old quarry. She held a small pouch tied at her waist, packed with what little dried resin and herbs she had left. What she needed now, sulfur and cedar, wasn't easy to find, especially in the middle of summer when the forest air hung thick and wet like a wool blanket. Ansel met her by the gate with a heavy cloak and 2 walking sticks. Storm might have washed out part of the path, he said. You'll need these to keep steady. I've walked worse, she replied, but took the stick anyway. She didn't say it out loud, but her legs ached more than usual, and her right ankle had begun to swell from days of standing, kneeling, lifting. She was tired, deep down tired, but there was no room for rest. Back in the village, Edmund was inside the chapel preparing a new ward for the sick. He had cleared out the far end of the building and torn down the faded tapestry that once hung behind the altar. It revealed an old stone wall, stained with water and soot. He didn't know why, but something about it made him uneasy. Maybe it was the symbol barely visible beneath the grime. A sunburst, faint but unmistakable. The same symbol the riders from the order bore on their cloaks. He traced it lightly with his fingers, then pulled away. The watchers were still in the village. Quiet, observant, but always near. Their presence made the villagers tense. It wasn't just their sharp eyes or the strange way they moved. It was the feeling they gave off, like they knew more than they said, like they were waiting for something. One of them, a younger man with a scar across his neck, had been seen speaking with 2 local farmers. No one knew what was said, but afterward, the farmers had begun to avoid Isolde. Meanwhile, sickness still lingered. It hadn't spread as quickly over the past 2 days, but the damage had already been done. A woman in her 40s lost her hearing after her fever broke. A boy developed shaking hands that wouldn't stop, even in his sleep. Strange symptoms, ones Isolde hadn't seen before, or hadn't connected to this illness. She wrote everything down in a small leather journal. She had no idea who had read it, but something in her told her to keep records. History had a way of forgetting the details that mattered most. Far from the village, the second group of riders, the ones sent from the city, were already crossing the northern marshes. They wore plain robes and carried no banners. Their leader, a man named Brother Halric, had been trained not in medicine, but in control. His task wasn't healing. It was containment. He carried with him a sealed letter signed by 3 senior bishops, authorizing full purification if needed. Purification, in their language, meant only one thing: fire. He had led similar efforts before, burned entire communities that had been declared too far gone. It was never easy, but he believed it was necessary. That's what they'd always told him. But this village wasn't like the others. The sickness wasn't behaving as expected, and the name that kept appearing in his reports, Isolde, was a name he hadn't heard in years. Not since the southern city of Garlith, where a similar illness had vanished overnight after she arrived. He remembered her face, even now, sharp eyes, stubborn mouth, hands that didn't shake even when everything else fell apart. He remembered how the council had branded her a danger, even after she'd stopped the outbreak. He also remembered how they lost track of her afterward. He didn't tell his men any of this. Not yet. Back in the forest, Isolde and Ansel reached the edge of the quarry. The path had washed out just as he'd predicted. Mud clung to their boots, and the air smelled like wet stone. They found the sulfur deposits tucked behind a jagged outcrop, yellowish and chalky. Ansel began to scrape it gently with a dull blade, packing it into wax-lined cloth. Isolde knelt nearby, checking the ground for cedar resin. She spotted a few hardened drops near the roots of a twisted tree and began collecting them, careful not to waste any. "This won't be enough for the whole village," Ansel said quietly. "No," she agreed, "but might be enough for the next 2 days." And after that, she didn't answer. They were heading back when they saw it. Smoke on the horizon, faint but too dark for a cooking fire. Ansel's face tightened. "That's coming from the east road." Isolde gripped her satchel. "That's where the first riders went." They quickened their pace, mud sucking at their feet with every step. By the time they reached the village edge, the smoke had faded, not from dying flames, but from being carried further north by the wind. Whatever had burned, it wasn't in the village. Not yet, but it was close. Inside the chapel, Edmund was reading from an old manuscript Isolde had left behind, a translation of a Greek physician's notes. It described something strange, a fever that attacked not only the flesh, but the senses, causing visions, whispers, even a sense of being watched. It had been dismissed in the margins as a spiritual affliction. But reading it now, Edmund felt uneasy. Several of the sick had reported hearing voices in their dreams. One had claimed to see black shapes moving across the ceiling, even in daylight. Edmund had chalked it up to fever hallucinations. Now he wasn't so sure. He was still reading when the door burst open. Isolde entered, mud streaked down her legs, a bundle of sulfur in her arms. "We have 2 days' worth," she said breathlessly. "Maybe 3 if we ration." Edmund took the bundle and unwrapped it. The smell was sharp, bitter. "I'm going to start mixing tonight," she said. "We'll need to seal off the back room. The fumes will be too strong." Ansel moved toward the hallway without a word, already preparing the space. Outside, the villagers gathered in small knots, whispering about the smoke, about the watchers, about what was coming. Some wanted to run. Others insisted they stay. One woman, the baker's sister, claimed she saw a man in white robes walking near the well after midnight. But when others checked, no one was there. The fear was starting to twist into something else now. Not just dread, suspicion. And in the midst of all this, a small girl, no more than 6, walked into the chapel alone. Her name was Lisa. She wasn't sick, but her father had been one of the first to fall ill. He was gone now. She walked straight to Isolde, held out a small woven doll, and said, "For the others, so they're not scared." Isolde knelt and took it gently. "Thank you." The moment stuck with her. That night, as thunder rolled again in the distance, she began to mix the sulfur compound. She ground the powder by hand, added vinegar, and heated it gently over low flame. The mixture sizzled and hissed, giving off a biting scent that burned the eyes. She worked in silence, thoughts spinning. What if this didn't work? What if it made things worse? What if the Watchers were right, and everything she'd done was only delaying the inevitable? And what if Brother Halric was already on the road, carrying fire and orders from those who didn't care how many were saved, only how many could be silenced? The chapel glowed dimly with candlelight. The sick stirred. The Watchers watched. And somewhere beyond the hills, riders approached with quiet hooves and sealed letters. The village waited, and the darkness kept coming. The moon rose slow and red over the rooftops, casting an eerie glow across the village. It hung low like it was watching. Everything felt quieter than it should have been. Even the sick had stopped groaning, as if the fever itself paused to listen. Inside the chapel, the sulfur mixture bubbled in its clay pot, its fumes curling through the cracks in the floor. Isolde stood over it, her face damp with sweat, one hand gripping a cloth she used to shield her nose. Her body ached, her eyes stung, but her mind refused to rest. She didn't know if this mixture would save anyone. All she knew was that doing nothing would mean more graves before morning. Ansel entered quietly, holding a bucket of cold water. "How much longer?" he asked. "An hour," Isolde replied, her voice muffled. "Then it cools. We'll paint it on door frames, floors. Let it settle in the lungs." He nodded. "Some of the villagers want to help." She looked up sharply. "No children. They're keeping them indoors. It's the older ones. They trust you now." Trust. A strange word in a place like this. Isolde didn't let herself feel it too deeply. Trust, she'd learned, could vanish with a whisper. All it took was one death, one outburst, one rumor. Still, by dawn, the village moved like a machine. Quiet, focused. Buckets of ash were prepared. The mixture was portioned into small jars. Isolde showed them how to use it. Dip a strip of cloth, wipe along windowsills and door cracks. The smell was awful, but tolerable. They wore coverings soaked in lavender water to keep from coughing too much. Edmund walked through the chapel, praying softly over each sickbed. He still didn't understand the science of what Isolde was doing, but he didn't need to. He saw the effect. The sick who had been gasping were now breathing more easily. Their eyes still glassy but calm. Something had shifted. Not a cure. Not yet, but a pause. A fighting chance. Then midday came, and with it, the sound they'd been dreading. Hooves. Again. But this time not from the east. They came from the north. Slow, measured, purposeful. Brother Halric had arrived. He rode with 6 others, all dressed plainly, but armed. No banners. No greetings. Just silence and eyes that scanned the village like they were reading a map of sins. Isolde stepped out into the street, wiping her hands on a linen rag. She kept her chin up, heart steady. Ansel moved beside her, then Edmund. Others came, forming a line, not defiant, but present. Howard dismounted. He was older than the last time Isolde saw him. Thinner, his hair grayer, but his eyes, sharp and unreadable, hadn't changed. "You've been busy," he said quietly. Isolde didn't blink. "So have you." He looked past her toward the chapel. "I've received reports of unauthorized texts, experimental mixtures, mass gatherings against church protocol. And I've seen your reports," she replied. "Villages burned. Entire families lost. No attempt at healing. Only fire." Howard's expression didn't shift. "Fire doesn't lie. But it forgets," she said. "It leaves nothing behind. No stories. No truth." He looked at her, long and hard, then turned to Edmund. "You're the priest?" "I am," Edmund said, voice steady. "Have you allowed her to perform these acts under your roof?" "I've allowed her to save lives." "That's not what I asked." Edmund didn't look away. "She's done more for this village than any bishop or order ever has." Howard stared at him, then turned back to Isolde. "You'll come with us. We have questions. You'll be returned if no fault is found." The words were hollow. Everyone knew it. If she went with them, she'd never be seen again. "I won't go," she said simply. Halric raised a hand. Behind him, one of his men stepped forward. But before anything could happen, the chapel doors burst open, and the girl, Lisa, ran out. "She helped us," the child cried, holding up her doll again. "You're not taking her." For a breath, no one moved. Then another villager stepped forward. Then another. Howard paused. His eyes scanned the crowd. He could order an arrest, start a fight. But they were outnumbered. And something else held him back. Something he hadn't expected. The village stood as one. He lowered his hand. "We'll return," he said, with authority. And then, as quickly as they came, they turned their horses and rode off. But everyone knew this was only a delay. That night, Isolde sat alone by the fire. She hadn't cried in years. But as the flames crackled and her hands trembled from exhaustion, something broke in her. Not out of fear, out of anger. Anger that she'd done everything right, helped, healed, protected, and still had to watch her back. Still had to worry about torches and chains. Ansel found her like that, eyes red, shoulders hunched. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her. "We're running out of time," she whispered. "I know. Even if this mixture holds, they'll come back. With more men. with orders they won't ignore. Ansel looked into the fire. Then maybe it's time we stop hiding. She turned to him. We tell the truth, he said. Everything. We show them the sick, the survivors, the mixtures. We send word to other villages. Make it public. Make it bigger than them. They'll silence anyone who tries. Not if there are too many of us. Isolde thought about that, then slowly nodded. The next morning, Edmund stood in the center of the square and read a letter aloud. A testimony of what had happened, who had fallen, who had lived. He signed it, then passed it to the blacksmith, the baker, the widow with 3 sons. They all signed, and then Isolde did too. The letter was tied to a dove's leg, one of the few left from the old tower, and it was released toward the city. They didn't know if it would make it, but they sent it anyway. Hope, after all, has to start somewhere. As the bird disappeared into the clouds, the villagers returned to their homes. They continued applying the mixture, continued caring for the sick, continued watching the horizon. And in a locked room inside the chapel, Isolde opened a final scroll. A remedy she hadn't dared try. One that involved a seed found only deep in the marshlands. Toxic in the wrong hands, but powerful. It was her last hope, and it would require one thing she'd run out of: time. The sickness was slowing, but the fire was coming, and the true test of medieval medicine, and of the people who dared to believe in it, was still ahead. Auric rubbed his fingers together as he walked, the cold clinging to his skin like a second layer. The air smelled faintly of dried herbs and wet soil. In the distance, the monastery bell rang again, a low, echoing chime that carried across the fields. It reminded him of the ticking of a slow, patient clock, a reminder that time passed, even in places where nothing ever truly changed. He followed the narrow dirt path that curved behind the herbal gardens and toward the apothecary chamber. He'd been here before, once, when he had cut his hand during harvest season. Brother Aemon, the monastery's apothecary, had stitched the wound with horsehair and sealed it with a thick brown salve that smelled of pine and vinegar. It had stung for days. Now, as Auric pushed open the creaking wooden door, that same bitter smell greeted him once more. Brother Aemon was bent over a mortar, grinding something into a dark, pulpy mush. His hands were stained, his nails dark with soil or soot. Auric couldn't tell. The room was lit by narrow shafts of afternoon light slicing through the slats in the wooden shutters. Jars lined the walls, some filled with dried plants, others with cloudy liquids and strange powders. A few held things that floated. Shapes. Eyes, maybe. Or was it just shadows? The monk didn't look up. "You're back early," he said, his voice hoarse but not unkind. Auric hesitated. The girl. She's not getting better. Brother Aemon stopped grinding. For a moment, silence settled thick in the room. She hasn't eaten. Her fever's worse. And her mother said something strange about a mark on her skin. A black circle. Now the monk looked at him. On the stomach? Auric nodded. Aemon's face didn't move, but something in his eyes tightened. He set the pestle down slowly and wiped his hands on his robe. "You said she hasn't eaten. Did she drink water?" "Only a little. She says it tastes like iron. Her voice is strange. Raspy, like it hurts to speak." The monk turned toward the back of the room, rummaging through a low cabinet. "Bring her to the cloister," he said, pulling out a bundle of cloth and a small wooden box. Before sunset, Auric stepped forward. "Is it the plague?" Brother Aemon paused, one hand still on the cabinet. "I don't know yet," he said softly, "but I've seen something like this before. Many winters ago." He didn't elaborate. Instead, he packed several jars and a small vial into the box and handed it to Auric. "Mix 1 drop of this into water only once. No more than that. And give her crush time, leaves with honey. If her stomach accepts it, she might gain strength for the journey." Auric stared down at the box in his hands. "And if she doesn't?" Brother Aemon's expression turned unreadable. "Then bring her anyway." The sun was dipping low by the time Auric returned to the hut. Smoke rose in thin streams from nearby chimneys, the village beginning its quiet descent into evening. Children were called in, windows shuttered, animals locked away. He found the girl lying curled on her side, her breath shallow, her face pale. Her lips were cracked, Her eyes opened when he entered, but they were glassy, unfocused. Her mother sat beside her, holding a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead. "She's been whispering nonsense," the woman murmured. "Things she couldn't know. Things I never told her." Alric knelt. "I brought something." The mother's eyes flicked to the box in his hands. "What is it?" "Medicine. From Brother Aemon." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "We'll try." He mixed the vial's contents, just a single drop, into a bowl of water and gave it to the girl slowly, spoonful by spoonful. She coughed at first, but swallowed, and her breathing seemed to ease just slightly. Enough. They wrapped her in thick blankets, tied her to Auric's back with cords and shawls. The path back to the cloister felt longer than before, each step a careful act of balance. The girl's weight was small, but her silence was heavy. The monastery gates stood open, and a pair of novices rushed forward as Auric arrived, taking the girl from him gently, reverently, as though she were something sacred and fragile. Brother Aemon appeared moments later, his robe soaked from the damp air, his hands already gloved. "Take her to the side chamber," he instructed. "No one else is to enter." Auric followed, breathless, muddy, and aching, but unwilling to leave. The side chamber was cold and dimly lit. A single candle flickered in the corner, its wax pooled in spirals. The girl was laid on a straw-stuffed mattress, the blankets tucked around her tightly. Aemon leaned close to her, examining the mark on her skin, round, dark, and strangely precise. "It spreads in circles," he muttered. "Always circles." "What is it?" Auric asked. "A disease." The monk didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and faced him. "You've read the old scrolls in the scriptorium, haven't you? The ones about bloodletting, humors, and spirits of the air." "Yes," Auric said slowly. "They're not just metaphor," Aemon said. "They come from something, fragments of truths passed through too many mouths, changed by fear." Auric blinked. "So you think this is something older?" Aemon nodded. "Before the humors, before Galen, before even the Romans, there were beliefs, ways of healing and harming that didn't involve scalpels or potions." He turned back toward the girl. "This mark, I've seen it once before, on a boy. He died within 3 days, but not of fever. His body shut down piece by piece. First the voice, then the eyes, then the heart." Auric's stomach turned. "But this girl might have something different," Aemon said, more to himself than to Auric. "Because she's lasted longer, and because she speaks in dreams." Auric's eyebrows raised. "Her mother said she whispered things she couldn't know." The monk met his eyes. "That boy did too." A long pause. "Then what is it?" "A curse." "No," Aemon said softly. "Worse. It's knowledge that doesn't belong." They sat in silence for a while, the candle burning lower. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the creak of wood and the howl of dogs. A sense of waiting hung in the air. That night, Auric stayed in the cloister, listening to the strange rhythm of the girl's breathing. Once just past midnight, she stirred and spoke, but the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, older, slow, and deliberate. The words came in a language neither he nor Aemon could recognize. Her lips moved, her eyes still closed, her face expressionless. Then just as suddenly it stopped, and she fell still again. Auric looked at the monk, who was scribbling furiously into a book. "What did she say?" Aemon didn't look up. "I don't know," he said, "but we need to find out, before it finds her again." Auric swallowed. "Before what finds her?" The monk didn't answer, and in the dark silence of the cloister, the candle flickered once and went out. The days turned colder, and the narrow streets of Old Barrack felt even tighter under the weight of fear and whispers. The apothecary's bell rang more often now, not for trade, but for help. Oswin had become a strange beacon in the village. Some called him wise, others cursed him as dangerous. But everyone, noble or peasant, found themselves needing his odd remedies when the other physicians failed. Behind his back, the clergy muttered that he was meddling with powers not granted by God. And yet, they too had sent for him quietly when a young monk began coughing blood. A sickly boy named Ewan had been brought to Oswin's workshop one foggy morning, his mother holding him tight, tears staining her cheeks. She'd already gone to the local doctor, who bled the boy and offered a poultice of leeches and moldy bread. Ewan had only grown weaker. Oswin bent down to the child's level and studied the purplish rash on his arms and the shallow rise of his chest. There was no confidence in his voice, but there was focus. He sent Thomas running for honey, sage, and something called willow bark, an herb only whispered about in Latin texts and rarely used outside monasteries. He crushed it, boiled it, and held the bitter tonic to the boy's lips. Ewan's recovery was slow, but real. In 5 days, he stood again. Word spread like fire in a dry hay field. People started skipping the barber surgeon entirely. Some came just to speak to Oswin about their ailments, real or imagined. But power, especially in a village like Berwick, was a fragile thing. It didn't take long for the church to notice. Father Aldrich, the same man who once welcomed Oswin into the parish for supper, changed his tone. During one sermon, he warned the town of false healers who played God, who brought tools from foreign lands and corrupted the divine balance. Oswin didn't speak against him, but inside, the heat of worry rose. He knew too well what happened to those accused of heresy, or worse, witchcraft, especially when their cures worked better than tradition. The conflict deepened when another physician arrived in town. He was tall, cloaked in thick wool, and rode a fine horse, a rare sight. His name was Master Remus, a doctor from York. He had been sent, it was said, by the bishop himself to investigate unsanctioned practices spreading in the northern villages. At first, Remus kept his distance, observing quietly. But it wasn't long before his curiosity became confrontation. One evening, Remus visited Oswin's shop under the pretense of goodwill. He walked the cluttered room with his gloves still on, lifting glass vials and prodding dried herbs with visible disdain. "So," he said in a cool voice, "you offer cures without bleeding or prayer? No scripture read over the sickbed?" Oswin replied plainly, "I offer what I can, what I've learned. The old ways do not always heal." Remus smiled without warmth. "And yet you risk the soul of every man you treat. Do you not fear what comes after?" It wasn't a question, not really. It was a threat buried in civility. That night, Thomas noticed a small fire lit near the edge of the woods, books burning. Old scrolls Oswin had hidden were missing. Someone had been inside. From that moment, the quiet battle turned into a full campaign. The town was dividing, not only between rich and poor, but between those clinging to familiar medicine and those desperate enough to try anything that worked. Even within Oswin's little group, unease grew. Thomas began questioning if the herbs they used were safe. One day, while preparing a tincture, he asked, "What if the church is right? What if this is pride in disguise?" Oswin didn't answer. He looked at the bubbling liquid, then at his own hands, scarred from years of grinding, mixing, testing. He didn't know anymore. All he had were results. But was that enough? Meanwhile, a subplot stirred outside the walls of the village. A nearby town, Dunmere, had been struck by a plague that no one could name. It turned skin pale, clotted the eyes with yellow crust, and left victims mumbling nonsense before death. Several bearer traders had been through Dunmere the week before the outbreak. If it spread, it would reach Berwick within days. Oswin and Thomas took what little coin they had and rode out on borrowed horses to see for themselves. What they found in Dunmere was worse than rumors. Entire streets were boarded. The town physician, a stern woman named Merwin, explained that the local authorities had ordered houses sealed with the sick still inside. She looked at Oswin with a guarded expression when he introduced himself. "I've heard of you," she said coldly. "The herbalist with a traveling mind. You may have helped a boy or two, but you cannot stop this. No one can." Still, Oswin offered to help. He spent the night tending to the worst cases, writing down symptoms in a leather-bound book. He noticed strange patterns, unlike the sweating sickness or the black pox. The eyes told him something. Not fear, not infection, something deeper. He couldn't explain it yet, but he felt it in his chest like a storm not yet broken. On their way back, they passed an old healer's hut on the edge of the woods. The woman who lived there, called Mere Idra, had once been famous for her healing skills, but she'd long been cast out by the church and lived in isolation. Oswin approached her as twilight fell. Her eyes were cloudy, but sharp. She smelled of mugwort and earth. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said before he even spoke. "It's not a plague. Not just one." "What do you mean?" She leaned in. "Something ancient is awake. The herds we know may not be enough this time. Look for the blue root, and beware the ones who come with silver." Oswin left with more questions than answers. Back in Barrack, the signs had already begun. A boy in the North Quarter began coughing blood. An old woman's skin turned pale overnight. Panic started its slow crawl. And in the shadows, Remus met with Father Aldrich again, whispering of purification, of the need to burn out the rot. As Oswin prepared a new batch of remedies, Thomas returned from the market pail and shaking. "They're coming," he said. "They're calling it divine punishment. They're saying you brought it here with your medicines." Oswin's hands froze. The warmth of the fire beside him did little to chase the cold now settling in his bones. The line between healer and heretic was vanishing, and the sickness? It was only just beginning. Word spread slowly in those days, passed from mouth to ear like secrets shared by candlelight. And as Brother Auric's unsettling remedies made their way across villages, not everyone was convinced they were miracles. Some said he was meddling with nature. Others whispered that his knowledge came from places no holy man should ever tread. Even within the monastery walls, some of the younger monks kept their distance. They watched him work in silence. Afraid of the jars he kept locked in the apothecary, where the strange symbols scribbled in Latin and Greek. One of those monks, a quiet lad named Martin, had grown especially uneasy. He was assigned to assist Brother Auric after the death of the previous apprentice, who, according to rumor, had succumbed to something he couldn't identify. Martin was obedient and sharp, but his eyes always flicked toward the door as if measuring how quickly he could escape if something went wrong. Auric noticed the nervous glances, but said nothing. In truth, he appreciated the silence. Most people spoke too quickly and listened too little. It was during one cold morning that the conflict truly began to stir. A messenger arrived, breathless and pale, from a village 3 days' ride to the east. His wife was burning with fever, and their healer had run out of ideas. The village, nestled deep in the woods and surrounded by ancient oak, had always been wary of outsiders, but desperation loosened their pride. They begged for Brother Auric to come. He agreed. Martin didn't like it. Something about the man's eyes, or the way he refused water, made his skin crawl. But he packed the supplies, including the ointments that smelled of crushed beetles and the thick, bitter syrups that induced vomiting. They rode in silence. When they arrived, the air smelled wrong. It was heavy with decay, as if the woods themselves had rotted. The villagers were quiet. Not cold exactly, just worn, like they had screamed for help until there was nothing left in them. The woman, Anna, was barely alive. Her skin shimmered with sweat, but her hands and feet were cold. Her tongue had swollen, and there were dark blotches under her skin that no one could explain. Auric examined her carefully, muttering under his breath. Martin stayed by the door, clutching a linen cloth to his nose. Flies buzzed everywhere. When Auric finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. He needed to stay the night. This wasn't just a fever, he said. It was something older, something that required patience and understanding. That night, Auric asked Martin to fetch a thick book bound in dark leather. Martin hesitated. That particular tome was forbidden to novices, a relic from an older time, written in languages only half translated. But Auric insisted. When he returned, Martin watched from the corner of the room as Auric lit a single candle and opened the book. The words didn't make sense to him, but the cadence of the chanting did. It wasn't prayer. It was something else. Anna didn't wake, but her skin cooled and her tongue shrank. Her husband called it a miracle. Auric called it recovery. Martin called it something else, something he didn't dare say out loud. They returned to the monastery with silent triumph, but the silence didn't last long. The monks had questions. How had he healed her? What remedy had worked? What prayer had saved her? Auric deflected. He said it was rest, fluids, the proper application of herbal mixtures. The answers satisfied most, but not all. One of the older monks, Brother Silas, had seen enough sickness to know the difference between natural recovery and something unnatural. He waited until night and then cornered Martin in the library. "You saw something," he said softly, his fingers resting on the edge of a shelf. "Tell me." Martin hesitated, torn between fear and truth. But something in Silas' gaze, steady, tired, and kind, unlocked him. He told everything. The book, the symbols, the chanting. Silas didn't speak for a long time. Then he nodded and said, "I thought so." He explained that before Auric's arrival, the monastery had once been home to another healer, a woman named Isolde. She'd been brilliant, powerful, and deeply misunderstood. Her methods, too, had bordered on the mystical, and like Auric, she performed impossible healings. But her work had eventually crossed a line, and she vanished one winter night, leaving behind only her books and jars of preserved things that no one dared open. Some believed she'd gone willingly into exile. Others said she'd been taken by the very forces she tried to harness. Martin was speechless. Auric had never mentioned her, never even hinted that someone before him had trodden the same path. Silas put a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful, lad. Not all knowledge is meant to be opened, and not all healing is holy." From that night onward, Martin watched Auric more closely, and what he saw disturbed him. He noticed how the older monk spoke less of God and more of balance, of equilibrium between the body and the unseen. He caught him mixing powders under moonlight, timing things not by sun or bell, but by planetary charts and rising stars. The whispers that followed Auric around the monastery began to swell. Whispers of forbidden medicine, of treating wounds with poison to teach the body to fight, of using bloodletting not to cleanse, but to channel. Then came the day the child was brought in. A boy no older than 7, pale and limp, with a wound on his leg that had turned black around the edges. His father wept as he handed him over, begging Auric to save him. Auric took the boy without a word. He cleaned the wound, packed it with a strange, pulpy mixture, and bound it tight. Then he locked the infirmary door and told Martin not to disturb him until morning. But Martin didn't sleep. He couldn't. He waited until the moon hung high and the hallway was still. Then he crept to the infirmary and pressed his ear to the door. He heard humming and a low, rhythmic sound of something being stirred. Then chanting, not Latin, not any tongue he knew. He returned to bed with shaking hands. The next morning, the boy was awake and alert. The wound was gone. Not healing gone, like it had never existed. That was the moment Martin knew something was deeply wrong. Healing, true healing, took time. No infection disappeared in a night, and certainly not wounds of that nature. He told Silas. The old monk listened, grave and quiet. Then he said something that would stick in Martin's mind for years. He's not curing sickness. He's feeding it. He's found a way to make it obey. The next few weeks passed in a strange quiet. Auric kept mostly to himself, speaking little during meals, spending long hours alone in the apothecary. Patients kept coming, quietly, discreetly, people from outside the village who had heard whispers and followed them like pilgrims. They came with fevers, seizures, growths, bleeding. Most left healed, but not all, and no one ever asked where the ones who didn't leave had gone. Martin started keeping a journal, notes on the remedies, observations on patient conditions, entries about Auric's behavior. He didn't know what he was searching for, just that he had to remember, had to track. Then came the dream. He saw the monastery cloaked in fog. He was alone in the chapel, and something was watching him from the shadows where the candles couldn't reach. It whispered in the voice of Brother Auric, but said things no man should know. The names of stars that had no place in heaven. The diseases that hadn't yet been born. The cure that would cost more than the illness. When he awoke, his hands were covered in ink. His journal was open, but the pages he'd written the night before had vanished, clean as if untouched. And that morning, Brother Silas was gone. No one had seen him leave. His room was empty, his robe folded neatly on the bed. No note, no trail, only a faint smell, sharp and herbal, lingered in the hallway. Martin didn't know what to believe anymore, but he knew this. Something terrible was happening under the name of healing. And whatever Brother Alric was doing wasn't medicine anymore. It was something else entirely. And the deeper Martin looked, the harder it became to tell whether Alric was saving lives or preparing something far darker. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Cold, relentless, and gray, it soaked through the mossy thatch roofs and trickled down the necks of peasants trudging along the narrow paths between their cottages and the small, dimly lit church. In the muddy square, a boy coughed violently as his mother wrapped a torn blanket around his shoulders. She cast a nervous glance toward the monastery's tower, where a single candle flickered behind stained glass. Word had spread that Brother Aldrich was attempting another healing ritual tonight, something more daring, something forbidden. Inside the monastery, Aldrich stood over a wooden table covered with scraps of parchment, dried herbs, and wax-sealed vials. The scent was thick and strange, part incense, part decay. He leaned closer to a bowl of liquid, its contents murky and slightly bubbling, and whispered a Latin phrase over it. The mixture hissed. Behind him, young Thomas, now his assistant for nearly a year, watched with wide eyes, gripping his worn satchel of instruments. "Will it help them?" Thomas asked quietly, stepping forward. Aldrich didn't answer immediately. He turned, eyes shadowed and face pale, and picked up one of the rolled parchments. "I hope so," he said, voice hoarse. "But this isn't in the text we've been taught. It's from the darker pages, from the ones we were told not to read." Thomas frowned. "But why not?" "Because those who didn't live long to share what they found." The boy stiffened but said nothing more. He understood now why Aldrich had been acting differently these past few weeks, sleepless, haunted, eyes darting at shadows, even in daylight. This wasn't about common folk ailments anymore. This was about something larger, older, more deeply buried in the roots of medieval medicine than he'd ever imagined. Meanwhile, in a cottage just beyond the village boundary, Lady Cecily sat beside her dying husband. Sir Godwin's skin had turned a sickly gray. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his eyes fluttered open only for seconds at a time. Beside the hearth, a midwife stirred a pot of broth, though everyone in the room knew it would do little good. Cecily had already sent word to the monks, begging them to come, begging Aldrich in particular. When the door creaked open, the entire room turned. Aldrich entered, cloaked in black, his satchel in hand and Thomas at his side. Without a word, he kneeled by the bedside and placed a hand on Godwin's forehead. It was cold. "This isn't plague," Aldrich murmured. "It's something else. Something I've only read about once." Lady Cecily's voice trembled. "Can you save him?" Aldrich didn't answer. He motioned for Thomas, who passed him a leather-bound book, one Aldrich never let out of his sight. Carefully, the monk turned the brittle pages, stopping at one nearly worn through. He traced a symbol with his finger, a curved line surrounded by tiny spikes, like a serpent with thorns. "This disease isn't natural," he whispered. "It's been placed in him." A quiet gasp filled the room. Thomas's heart pounded. Lady Cecily blinked slowly, unsure whether she'd misunderstood. "What do you mean placed?" "I think someone did this intentionally." Back in the monastery, another monk, Brother Anselm, discovered that one of the forbidden texts had gone missing. His alarm spread quickly. Whispers filled the cloisters. Aldrich had been seen leaving the scriptorium at night, and now the old records, those containing treatments, curses, and rituals outlawed since the early days of the church, were gone. Anselm feared what this meant, especially with strange illnesses surfacing in neighboring towns. A council was called. The abbot was stern. "We must not let fear distract us from the will of God. But if Aldrich has strayed into heresy, we cannot let him continue. The church forbids what he is doing." "But what if he's right?" a younger monk asked. "What if something dangerous really is spreading?" "Then it is punishment," the abbot replied firmly, "and it must be met with prayer and purity, not pagan rituals." But not everyone in the council agreed. A few monks remembered tales buried deep in oral history, tales of healers who once walked the line between medicine and mysticism, people who knew of poisons that couldn't be traced, of rituals older than Rome itself. whispered down from the Druids and hidden beneath centuries of Christian layers. In a secret chamber behind the church, Anselm met with an older woman, Mother Agnes, the last of a line of local wise women who had served the people when the church turned them away. She had known Aldrich as a boy. Her lined face was solemn. "He's following echoes," she said, "ones he doesn't fully understand. The dark parts of medicine, they come with a price." Anselm's eyes narrowed. "And what do you think he'll find?" "Not what he's looking for," she whispered. "Something much worse." Back in the cottage, Godwin began convulsing. Aldrich acted quickly, drawing a circle on the floor using powdered hemlock and vinegar. Thomas was told to close the windows and not let anyone disturb the air. The room stank. Cecily looked on in horror, unsure whether she was witnessing salvation or madness. Then, Aldrich raised a vial filled with something dark, thicker than blood, nearly black. He hesitated only a second before pouring it into Godwin's mouth. The reaction was immediate. Godwin's body tensed, arched, then went still. A low wheezing escaped him, then silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then he opened his eyes. Aldrich leaned in. "Do you know your name?" Godwin nodded weakly. "Yes." Lady Cecily burst into tears, holding his hand. Thomas breathed out in awe, but Aldrich's face remained tight. He stared down at the healed man, but his gaze was not relief. It was confusion and fear. He pulled Thomas aside. The ritual worked too fast. That was supposed to take hours. Something changed. The disease didn't leave him. It hid. Thomas didn't understand. It's like it's waiting, watching. That night, Aldrich returned to the monastery to find his chambers ransacked. Books were missing, pages torn. And nailed to his door was a message in rough script: "Stop, or more will fall." The next day, a second patient was found near death in the village, a child this time. And the symptoms weren't just similar, they were identical. As Aldrich prepared his instruments again, he knew this wasn't coincidence. This was coordinated. The disease wasn't just spreading, it was being guided. Someone was using knowledge of medieval medicine not to heal, but to harm. And the ancient secrets Aldrich had thought long forgotten were resurfacing, only now in the wrong hands. The question was no longer if he could stop it. The question was who had started it, and why. In the dead silence of the woods beyond York, Thomas could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. He stood just beyond the boundary of the monastery garden, his eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight within the small apothecary room, where Brother Edric and two others whispered over what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in cloth. From a distance, it looked like just another night of mixing herbs and salves. But Thomas had seen too much, and now he knew too much. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't healing. It was something else, something darker. That same day, he'd uncovered records tucked away beneath the floorboards of an old monk's quarters. They weren't official monastery documents. They were written in a hurried private hand, journal entries, possibly from someone who no longer lived there. The entries spoke of forced bloodlettings, of tests on fevered villagers who were never seen again, of potions brewed with no known ingredients. They described something chilling, an unholy alliance between certain members of the clergy and a group of healers who'd long since been shunned by traditional medicine. This wasn't just ignorance or misguided cures. This was experimentation, and it was being hidden under the name of God and healing. What struck Thomas the hardest was that the notes mentioned a cure of shadows, a concoction made not to heal the body, but to control it. Symptoms suppressed, not healed. Pain dulled, not relieved. Patients kept alive not for compassion, but for observation. One line etched into his memory: "They do not seek to cure sickness, but to master it." It sent chills down his spine. Meanwhile, word had spread of a sudden illness gripping a village to the south. People were collapsing in the streets, their skin growing pale, their speech slurred, and their eyes dark as if bruised from the inside. Brother Edric had insisted it was a divine punishment, a test of faith, and forbade anyone from the monastery to travel south. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen the symptoms before, described in those secret notes. The so-called cure of shadows had failed there. He was sure of it. They tried it on innocent villagers, and now people were dying. Agnes, too, had been quietly collecting her own pieces of the truth. While assisting the midwife near the market square, she'd heard whispers from old women who remembered when Brother Edric arrived nearly 2 decades ago, how the old healer who once served the village vanished just before Edric's rise in influence. How Edric had forbidden the use of certain herbs, even those known to work for generations, calling them devil's leaves. How those who questioned him became sick not long after. And worst of all, how some never woke up again after visiting the monastery for a cure. Back in the scriptorium, young Martin had translated more pages from the Latin texts he'd uncovered in the library vault. One of them wasn't a medical guide at all. It was an account of trials conducted centuries earlier in Italy, where religious figures attempted to bind disease to the body, delaying death in the hope of achieving full understanding of illness. The results have been horrifying, patients rendered mute, docile, and eventually mad. And Martin found a diagram, crudely drawn but familiar, a symbol etched on the vial Thomas had found weeks ago in the woods, buried beneath a collapsed shack. The same vial now locked away in Edric's chamber. Something ancient and dangerous was being practiced again. They called it medicine. They claimed it as faith. But it was control. It was experimentation wrapped in prayer. Tension began to seep into the daily rhythm of the monastery. Thomas noticed fewer villagers visiting the infirmary. A woman who had been recovering from a leg infection vanished. Her bed left unslept in the next morning. When he asked Edric, the brother simply said, "She has gone to be with the Lord," but no one had seen her body. No burial was held. No mourning. That same evening, Thomas caught one of the novices, Brother Hale, sneaking into the root cellar. He followed quietly and watched as Hale opened a trapdoor beneath the barrels. A staircase descended into pitch-black darkness. Holding his breath, Thomas waited until Hale disappeared below, then made his way back to Agnes. Agnes listened closely, her brow furrowed as she pieced together what she had learned. This isn't healing, Thomas. This is control through fear. The sicker we become, the more they preach. The more they preach, the more power they hold. Together, they returned to the cellar that night. They waited until the others were asleep and slipped inside with nothing more than an oil lamp and a knife tucked into Agnes' belt. The air below was cold and thick. The stone steps seemed to go on forever, and the moment they reached the bottom, the smell hit them. Acrid, metallic, like rust and rot. What they found was not a storage room. It was a chamber of records and failures. Wooden tables with restraints, books written in multiple hands detailing symptoms and reactions. Jars of fluids they couldn't identify. Drawings of body parts. Pages smeared with ink and something darker. Agnes stopped in front of a cot where a figure lay still beneath a thin blanket. The woman's face was pale, her lips barely moving. "She's still alive," Agnes whispered. "But her pupils, she's been drugged." Before they could act, the sound of a door slamming above startled them. They doused the lamp and crouched low. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Brother Edric's voice, calm but commanding, called down. "You shouldn't be here." The silence between his words and their breath was thick with fear. He descended slowly, holding a torch that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Behind him, 2 monks followed, each holding something, one a staff, the other a book. Edric looked directly at Thomas. "You wanted to understand the roots of healing, didn't you? Well, here they are. The foundation. Medicine is not a blessing, child. It is sacrifice. We test, we fail, we test again. The church has always known this. But he stepped closer, you want the truth, and the truth is cruel." Agnes held the woman's hand tightly, her eyes defiant. "She's not your subject. She's a human being." Edric sighed, as if he were disappointed. "You think healing comes without cost? Do you think your clean herbs and hopeful prayers will banish fever, plague, and madness? No. Real knowledge requires pain, and pain brings clarity." Thomas stepped in front of Agnes, fists clenched. "You're not healers. You're tormentors hiding behind robes." The tension in the chamber reached a breaking point. Edric raised his torch higher. "Then you leave me no choice." Before anything else could happen, the flame flickered violently, and a low rumble shook the chamber walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. The torch went out. Screams echoed from above. Something was happening in the monastery. Thomas grabbed Agnes's arm, and together they fled back up the stairwell, heart pounding, the unconscious woman cradled between them. But as they reached the top, the hallways were no longer quiet. Doors slammed, monks shouted, and a thick fog rolled in through the open doors of the cloister. It wasn't natural. The fog carried something with it, something Thomas could feel in his lungs, heavy and wrong. A new sickness? A reaction? Had they triggered something by entering that room? They couldn't stop now. They had to escape. They had to expose it. But the deeper they ran into the stone halls, the more they realized they weren't just uncovering medieval medicine. They were unraveling something ancient, still alive and waiting. The flickering torchlight danced along the damp stone walls of the monastery cellar, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. Brother Thomas stood frozen, staring at the ancient manuscript laid open on the table. His heart thudded in his chest, faster now, as he read the final line once more. It wasn't just a treatment, it was a confession masked as a remedy, written in a way only the most desperate or most cunning healer could understand. The last few weeks of unexplained deaths, fever outbreaks, and quiet excommunications suddenly made sense. Outside, a storm rumbled over the hills, wind howling through the cracks in the ancient walls. Every drop of rain seemed to echo the dread building inside Thomas. Behind him, Brother Alan stepped closer, the soft scuff of his sandals breaking the silence. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and wary. Thomas nodded slowly. "It's not just misguided knowledge. It's intentional." They knew the treatments were dangerous, that they killed more often than healed. But they kept using them anyway. To control, to silence. Alan's face paled. The bloodletting, and the mercury, Thomas added, and the wormwood. But worse than that, they wrote rituals into the cures. Superstition wrapped in medicine, told villagers that their sickness was caused by curses or sins, that their only salvation was obedience. Alan's hands trembled slightly as he leaned over the manuscript. This was taught in the name of healing. How many have died because of this? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them was already heavy with the weight of every life lost in pain and confusion, thinking they were being saved. Back in the village of Elmford, the air was thick with unease. The apothecary, Mistress Eleanor, had noticed the tension in her customers. They whispered about the monks, about the recent deaths, about the strange scent that lingered on some of the remedies delivered by cloaked travelers from the abbey. Some claimed their loved ones had gotten worse after taking the concoctions. Others said they'd seen hallucinations, visions of demons, old gods, or voices calling them to the river. She tried to dismiss the rumors, but now, even she wasn't sure anymore. Just yesterday, a child named Jonah had collapsed after drinking a tonic she didn't recognize. One left at her doorstep with a note stamped by the abbey seal. Jonah's mother had begged her for answers, but Eleanor had none. Only doubt, and a growing fear she'd been used as a tool without knowing it. And that fear had driven her to take a risk. She'd sent her apprentice, young Martha, to follow one of the cloaked riders back toward the monastery. Martha, smart and bold beyond her years, had memorized their path, slipped past their sentries, and hidden in the undercroft. What she saw there would change everything. 3 monks gathered around a patient bound to a table. The man's skin was yellowing, his breath ragged. But instead of comfort or healing, the monks chanted in low, guttural tones, placing leeches along his chest and rubbing a thick black salve into wounds that clearly festered. One of the monks, a pale, thin man with sharp eyes, held up a vial of silvery liquid. He muttered, "Let the spirits take the sickness," before forcing it down the man's throat. The man screamed. Martha had barely escaped, heart pounding as she hid under a stairwell and waited until the sound of footsteps faded. When she returned to Eleanor, she was shaking, her voice hoarse from crying. She told her everything, every chant, every ingredient, every scream. Eleanor listened, then placed a hand on Martha's shoulder. "You were brave," she whispered. Now we have to be careful. Very careful. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a former soldier named Edwin, now working as a grave digger, began noticing strange marks on the bodies he buried. Tiny circles burned into the skin, black powder in the nostrils. And on more than one occasion, the corpse would arrive wrapped in linen, soaked in a mixture that smelled oddly of sulfur and mold. He'd seen the battlefield, seen plague and war, but this was something else. He began recording the symbols in a small journal. At night, he compared them to old drawings his mother used to keep, illustrations of medieval charms and protective wards. It wasn't healing they were performing, he realized. It was experimentation, ritual, sacrifice. In the monastery, Thomas had started leaving coded messages for Eleanor. Parchments hidden inside old herb pouches. Each one described a part of the treatments and which patients had died after receiving them. Eleanor read every word with growing horror. She cross-checked the names with her records. It matched. Every single death, every unexplained illness. The puzzle was coming together, but what they found at the center was darker than anything they expected. The Abbey wasn't merely misguided. It was protecting a legacy of power through fear. A long tradition where medicine was not about curing, but controlling. Where those who questioned the healers were labeled sinners, or worse, infected by demons. And now, it seemed, some among them were reviving these practices in secret. But why? The answer came in the form of an old letter, found in the crypt beneath the monastery, sealed in wax and dust, addressed not to any monk, but to a long-forgotten bishop who'd been exiled for heresy and moral corruption. The letter described a ritual, one believed to transfer sickness from the body of the healer into the patient, a forbidden rite condemned by the church, but said to offer unholy strength to those who dare perform it. Thomas read the letter twice, then burned it, but its words burned into his mind. Some of the monks believed they could live forever. Outside the monastery, people had begun whispering again about how some of the monks never seemed to age, how one had survived a plague that took an entire village, and how others had been seen at night in the graveyards, chanting over freshly dug soil. The line between medicine and magic was disappearing. In the woods, Eleanor met Thomas under cover of night. They exchanged knowledge, her findings, his confessions. And together, they formed a plan. But it wouldn't be safe. They'd have to move quietly, observe, gather names, find the root of it all, and expose it without tipping off those who'd kill to keep it secret. But something else was happening too. Martha had fallen ill, feverish and pale. She muttered things in her sleep, things she shouldn't know. Names of monks she'd never met. Places deep in the monastery she couldn't have seen. Eleanor feared the worst, that whatever they were doing in the abbey had touched Martha, left a mark on her, maybe even opened a door that should have remained shut. The night air grew colder. The sky over the village seemed darker than usual. And in the distance, bells rang, low, solemn, and slow. A death knell. But whose death? And was it natural? Or was another treatment being administered? No one knew for sure. But Thomas, Eleanor, and a few brave others now understood one thing clearly. The secrets buried beneath the monastery were more than just remnants of a forgotten era. They were still alive, still working, still harming. And if they didn't stop it soon, they feared what might be unleashed next. Because in the world of medieval medicine, healing was never the whole truth. Sometimes, the cure was worse than the curse. The door to the apothecary's storeroom creaked open slowly, as if the building itself feared what lay inside. Thomas stepped in, holding the lantern steady. The walls were lined with jars, some clearly labeled, others so old and dust-covered that the writing had faded into ghostly smudges. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling like lifeless bats, and a thick smell of damp earth and burnt resin clung to everything. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, her hand lightly brushing the wooden frame. She could feel something in the air, something unsettled. Thomas motioned her inside. "This is where Master Jerome kept his private remedies," he whispered, though no one else was around to hear. Things he wouldn't use in front of villagers. or even other healers. Eleanor stepped carefully over a stack of bundled roots and followed him to a large locked chest in the corner. It looked out of place, newer than the rest of the room, its iron hinges clean of rust. Thomas fumbled in his coat and pulled out a small brass key. "He told me never to open this unless I had no other choice," Thomas said, voice thick with hesitation. "But I think we're already far beyond that." He turned the key. The chest opened with a metallic sigh, and inside lay a collection of vials and scrolls wrapped in animal skin. Thomas lifted one and unrolled it, revealing tightly written lines of Latin and strange symbols sketched in the margins. Eleanor leaned in, trying to make sense of the writing, but her eyes were drawn to the vials. One was filled with a dark green liquid, so thick it barely moved when tilted. Another looked like old blood, turned almost black. But it was the third vial, clear as water and sealed with red wax, that caught her attention. "What is this?" she asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I've never seen it used. But it's marked with the sign of the eye. Look." He pointed to the scroll. Near the bottom, next to a sketched figure of a man writhing in agony, was a symbol, a single eye enclosed in a triangle. Eleanor had seen that before, not in any book, but carved discreetly into the stone beneath the cathedral's altar. It was old, older than the church itself, perhaps. "I've been trying to translate this for months," Thomas admitted. "But there are things in here, rituals, mixtures, words I don't recognize. It's not just healing. It's something else." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "This isn't medicine. This is something darker." Just then, the wind outside slammed against the walls of the shop, rattling the windows so fiercely that one cracked. They both jumped, startled. Thomas closed the chest quickly and stood. "We need to leave this place for now," he said. "I'll take what I can and study it at home." But Eleanor wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the cracked window and the shadow that passed by outside. Someone had been watching. They left quickly, slipping out into the damp night, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Each corner they turned, each street lamp that flickered, added to her growing unease. Back at Thomas's cottage, they spread out the materials on the wooden table, lighting several candles to keep the shadows at bay. Hours passed as they worked side by side, deciphering piece by piece. The scrolls spoke of ancient practices, long before medieval physicians began cataloging illnesses or balancing humors. They told of forbidden knowledge brought from the East, of secret guilds of plague doctors who were not healers, but silencers. And woven through all of it was the eye, watching, always watching. Then they came to a passage that chilled Eleanor's blood. It described a town, lost to history, where a healer had tried to stop the spread of an unknown sickness using a forbidden tonic derived from nightshade, mercury, and a few drops of clear liquid, the same kind in the wax-sealed vial. The mixture worked. The plague stopped. But every patient who drank it changed. They didn't die, but they weren't human anymore. Thomas set the scroll down slowly. "It's not just medicine. It's a kind of control. It suppresses illness, but it takes something else in return." Eleanor whispered, "Like the soul." Before Thomas could reply, someone pounded on the door. Once, then again. They both froze. 3 hard knocks, then silence. Thomas grabbed a poker from the fire, while Eleanor cautiously moved to the window. A figure in a hooded cloak stood in the road, unmoving, watching the house. Then slowly, the figure raised its hand and pointed directly at her. Thomas pulled her away from the window. "That's not a traveler," he said. "That's someone who knows what we found." They locked the doors, shuttered the windows, and doused the lights. The figure outside didn't move for a long time. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared down the road. In the darkness, Eleanor spoke. "What if that tonic? What if someone's still using it?" Thomas didn't answer. He stared down at the sealed vial, the red wax catching the candlelight like dried blood. The next morning, they found the door to the apothecary broken open. The chest was gone. So were all the scrolls and vials they hadn't taken. But there was no sign of a break-in. No footprints. No drag marks. Just a single eye carved into the wall where the chest had been. Someone had taken it, but not for knowledge. They wanted the secret kept buried. Eleanor and Thomas knew they had only one option left: to find the others who might have studied these forbidden cures, the ones who had survived using them, and the ones who never should have. So they set out on the road again, moving from village to village, following cryptic notes in the margins of old herbal texts, gathering whispers from midwives and monks too frightened to speak aloud. But one name kept appearing, scribbled faintly in old books and letters. A man called Silas of Wormwood. A man who, according to all records, had died during the Black Death, yet was seen alive nearly 50 years later. A man who might know the final ingredient in the tonic that stopped death, but stole something far greater in return. And somewhere, in the shadows behind them, the hooded figure still watched, waiting, ready for what came next. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke just after midnight. The wind howled through the cracks of stone walls, whistling through the empty corridors of the healer's cottage. Inside, Anselm worked under candlelight, sweat rolling down his temple despite the chill in the air. He held the lancet over the flame, sterilizing it, or at least believing he did. The village boy lay feverish on the wooden table, eyes rolling back, lips pale. His mother sobbed quietly in the corner, praying not to the saints, but to anyone who might be listening. In those days, the body was a mystery few dared to question. Anatomy was a privilege of war and punishment, not learning. The church forbade the dissection of the dead, so physicians had only theories and fragments of ancient texts to guide them. Yet Anselm defied that rule, in secret. Beneath the flagstones in his cellar was a world not meant to exist. Scraps of parchment, crude drawings of organs, even the remains of a hanged thief, buried not in consecrated ground, but on the edge of the moor. Anselm's need to understand the body had grown into something dangerous. And now, he was closer to something no one else dared admit: the truth. The village of Dalwyn had grown increasingly restless. People whispered of demons, of curses that could not be healed. Ellen, the herbalist, found her own home marked with ashes one morning, a silent threat. She knew it wasn't just fear, it was control. If the church couldn't explain the suffering, then someone had to be blamed. Knowledge, to them, was the most dangerous kind of rebellion. But even Ellen had her doubts. Not about herbs or the power of plants. Those truths were older than stone. But about the lines people crossed when desperation grew teeth. She had seen it before, good men losing their way when they thought they were saving lives. And Anselm, despite his calm voice and gentle hands, had started asking questions that made her uneasy. Not just how the body worked, but how far it could be pushed before it failed. Ellen still visited him, mostly in secret, bringing bundles of dried foxglove, monkshood, and willow bark. She warned him against using too much. Some herbs cured, some killed. Some did both. But he was always careful, or had been, until recently. The boy on the table had been the blacksmith's apprentice, a strong, healthy lad who had fallen sick after cutting himself with a rusted blade. His wound had festered, his fever climbing day after day. Anselm had tried everything. Leeches, poultices, prayers whispered under breath. But the infection spread. It was as if the body had turned on itself. Something unseen and unstoppable. It wasn't magic. It was something else. And Anselm, deep in his heart, knew it was because they didn't understand the disease, not truly. Bloodletting was guesswork. Herbs were sometimes wrong. They needed knowledge. Real knowledge. A few days later, the body of a monk was discovered near the riverbank. No wounds, no blood. Just a lifeless corpse, eyes wide open, lips parted as if in a final, unfinished thought. He had been one of the louder voices condemning Ellen and Anselm. Now he was gone, and fear grew roots in Dalwyn. No one dared accuse anyone openly. But the timing was strange. The healer who defied the church, the herbalist who spoke in riddles, and now a holy man, silenced. Brother Caderick, the newly arrived Benedictine, took charge of the investigation. He was young, intelligent, and unlike most clergy, deeply curious. He had heard rumors of Anselm's work, and unlike the others, he did not come to destroy it. Not yet. Instead, he visited late one evening, candle in hand, robes soaked from the rain. I don't believe in coincidences, he said quietly as Anselm opened the door, especially not when people begin to die in strange ways. Anselm nodded and stepped aside. Then you've come to the right place. What followed was a tense, quiet exchange over tea and shadow. Cadric questioned everything. The cellar, the books, the body beneath the stone. He didn't condemn it, but neither did he approve. He was a man split in two, between the vows of his faith and the thirst for truth he couldn't deny. I've read Galen, he said, and Hippocrates. They offer much, but leave more unanswered. And yet, Anselm replied, we are expected to heal based on their words alone. Cadric's silence spoke louder than agreement. He knew something was wrong, deeply wrong, with the world they lived in. Disease wasn't sent by God. It followed patterns. It moved, changed, spread. There was logic beneath the suffering, but the tools to uncover it had been locked away by fear and tradition. Meanwhile, Ellen had her own questions. She had been watching the village carefully, recording which herbs failed, which fevers spread, who died, and how. And a disturbing pattern had begun to emerge. The sickest patients were all from one side of the village, closer to the river. She visited an older midwife, Morella, who lived in a crumbling hut outside Darwin. Morella had seen things others hadn't. She remembered the last time the river turned dark, the year of the red rash, when children were buried 3 to a grave. It had been nearly 30 winters ago, and no one spoke of it anymore. But she remembered. They dug too deep, Morella whispered, by the river, an old burial pit. The ground there is cursed. Ellen didn't believe in curses, but she believed in rot, in disturbed soil, and water tainted by death. It wasn't magic. It was nature, angry and ignored. She hurried back to Anselm and Cadric and told them what she had learned. But they were already one step ahead. Cadric had been reviewing old church records, and a page had been torn from the ledger the year the rash first appeared. Someone tried to erase history, Cadric said. But why? Ellen asked. Anselm frowned. Because they knew what caused it, and they let it happen again. Tension rose like smoke. The infection wasn't a random curse. It had a source. One the church had hidden. One buried beneath politics and pride. And if it wasn't stopped now, it would spread further. Already, a new child had fallen ill. The same pattern. The same symptoms. They had no more time for secrets. But the village was watching. Eyes behind curtains. Whispers in the tavern. Anselm's name spoken like a warning. Cadric, already under suspicion for his closeness to the healer. And Ellen, called a witch more openly now than ever before. If they were going to act, it had to be fast and quiet. The three of them decided to return to the river that night. They would dig where the soil was soft, search for the burial pit, and confirm what they already feared. But someone was watching them, and someone else had other plans. They moved through the darkness, cloaks drawn, torches low. The moon was thin and cold. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sound of movement that wasn't theirs. When they reached the spot, the earth had already been disturbed. Someone had been there first. Anselm knelt and brushed away the damp soil. Bone, fragile, brittle, a child's skull. Beside it, a rusted clasp, the kind used for sealing plague robes. And deeper still, glass vials, broken, leaking something foul-smelling into the ground. Cadric backed away in horror. They didn't just bury the dead here. They buried what killed them. Waste from the last outbreak, Anselm said quietly. And when the rains came this year, it seeped into the river, Ellen finished. Into the homes. Into the children. But before they could say more, they heard a branch snap behind them. They turned, torches raised, and standing just beyond the tree-line was a figure in dark robes, face hidden, hands gloved. Not a priest, not a healer, someone who had been watching all along. And they weren't alone. The tension in the village had reached its peak. Whispers about the healer's strange herbs and forbidden books had turned into outright accusations. Villagers who had once stood behind her now looked away when she passed, crossing themselves or clutching at their charms. Brother Aldrich had gathered more supporters, people who had lost loved ones to the pox or the fever and now blamed the ancient remedies, not the illness, for their grief. Every cough, every shadow, Every smell of burning roots from the healer's hut fed into the fear, spreading through the muddy streets like fire on dry thatch. Thomas, the apprentice, felt the pressure building as he helped the healer work day and night. More people had begun showing up at their door. Desperate mothers with feverish children, injured farmers with festering wounds, old men whose joints refused to bend without screaming pain. The healer treated them all the same, calmly, with care, relying on her strange mixtures of dried fungus, animal grease, and secret poultices. Yet even Thomas began to question what he was learning. He had seen wounds heal, but also people who worsened quickly or never returned. It wasn't just the medicine. The tension came from something else, too. A secret the healer wasn't sharing. At night, Thomas would hear her speaking in a tongue he didn't recognize, kneeling by the hearth, pressing her hands into the dirt and whispering as if the earth itself could answer back. Once he caught her burning something wrapped in linen and bone. When he asked her about it, she didn't scold him. She just smiled with tired eyes and said, "Some things are older than prayer." Even he didn't know what that meant. Meanwhile, Brother Aldrich began pushing harder. One evening, the village elders held a quiet gathering, and Thomas overheard their talk. Aldrich wanted to involve the Baron's men. He claimed the healer had caused a death by witchcraft. A boy had fallen ill with a fever and died within a day of receiving one of her treatments. Thomas knew the truth. The boy was already fading before the healer touched him. But the story was out now, told in wine-soaked fear by candlelight. The healer, for her part, remained strangely calm. She sensed the tide turning, but instead of hiding, she took Thomas to the woods, deeper than they had ever gone before. She showed him where she gathered her herbs, not just from the roots of familiar plants, but from moss-covered stones and inside hollow trees where insects crawled. She pulled a twisted root from the soil and whispered, "This is older than any church, older than fear. It remembers what we've forgotten." That night, they returned in silence. Thomas felt the pull of something deeper than the healer's words. A rawness in the air, as though the forest itself was watching them, as though it knew something no one else did. Back in the village, fear turned to action. Brother Aldrich stood outside the healer's hut the next morning, surrounded by angry faces. Some were crying, others holding torches. One of the men had lost a wife after taking the healer's remedy. Another claimed his dreams were haunted ever since visiting her home. Aldrich raised his voice, not in rage, but in solemn warning. This is not medicine. This is the work of shadows, of poison and pride. The healer stepped out, calm and composed, and said nothing at first. Her silence made them angrier. Thomas stood behind her, heart pounding, unsure if he should run or fight or speak. The healer finally looked at Aldrich and said, "You fear what you refuse to understand, and that fear will cost more lives than I ever could." That only made the villagers more furious. But something else happened before the mob could act. A strange sound came from the hills, low and steady, like a hum through stone. Birds flew from the trees, and the wind shifted, carrying the scent of something damp and ancient. Some of the torches flickered. People looked around nervously, and then came the screams from the edge of the village. A farmer came running, face pale, carrying his limp daughter in his arms. She was burning with fever. He cried out that she had only drunk the water from the well, but now she wouldn't wake. Another woman collapsed by the chapel steps, clutching her chest, her lips turning blue. Then more, dozens of them, sickened within minutes. Panic broke the crowd. The healer rushed to the sick without waiting for permission. Thomas followed, helping her carry a child, grabbing pouches of herbs, clean cloths, anything they could find. People who had cursed her minutes ago now begged her to help. But she was shaken. This wasn't like before. She examined one of the victims, a boy no older than 7, and her hand trembled. "This isn't pox," she whispered. "It's something else." Brother Aldrich stood frozen, unsure whether to accuse or pray. By nightfall, more than 20 people had fallen ill. The healer worked non-stop, her eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. Thomas watched her crush bark into powder, stir strange liquids, and mumble words he couldn't understand. She moved like she was fighting time, as if something terrible was just ahead. And still, more villagers grew weak. Then the healer stopped everything. She went to the edge of the forest and stood there, staring into the trees for what felt like forever. Thomas followed but stayed back. She didn't speak. She just raised her hand and pressed her fingers into the bark of an old tree. Her lips moved, almost too softly to hear. Thomas stepped forward. "What is it?" She turned to him, her face drawn. "This isn't natural. Something's been awakened. Something that should have stayed buried." His skin went cold. She continued, almost to herself. "They dug too deep near the spring. They disturbed the earth. They don't know what they've touched." He didn't understand, but he didn't ask. The look in her eyes, he hadn't seen that before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was knowledge, heavy and old. That night, the healer lit a fire outside her hut and burned herbs no one recognized. The smell was thick and strange, curling through the streets. Some villagers protested, but most were too afraid to stop her. She told Thomas that if she failed tonight, the sickness would take them all. And as the moon rose, full and cold, the ground seemed to hum again. The final warning had come. Something beneath the village wasn't just causing sickness. It was waking up. The sun was setting over the moss-covered rooftops of the village, casting a long shadow across the apothecary's garden. Elena stood frozen, her hands still shaking from what she'd just read. The final page of her grandfather's journal didn't offer a remedy. It was a confession. Not of guilt exactly, but of fear. He had once believed, like most physicians of his time, that bloodletting and humors were the answer to every illness. But something changed after he encountered the patient called the Crow Man. Elena blinked back tears as she remembered the cryptic letter her grandfather left her, the one that led her here in the first place. It made sense now. He hadn't sent her to find ancient knowledge. He sent her to confront the darkness hidden beneath it. He had failed to stop it, and now she was standing in the same garden, decades later, with the same choice: walk away or go deeper. Inside the cottage, Lucien paced with a candle in one hand and the strange iron tool they had found in the other. "This isn't just for leeching," he said, almost to himself. "This was used for something else, something more precise." Elena nodded. "A trepan. For boring into the skull. It was used to let spirits out, they thought, or to quiet madness." Lucien looked up. There were no signs of burial. Only bones tossed behind walls like garbage. "You don't treat patients like that." She exhaled sharply. Unless they weren't patients. They were subjects. Lucien fell silent. That night, the storm rolled in from the east. The two stayed up late, oil lamps flickering against the stone walls. Each room in the cottage seemed to breathe with history. Uneasy, tense, hiding something. In the cellar, they found more than herbs. There were jars, sealed and blackened with age, each one labeled with Latin names of illnesses and people. Febris Antonina, M. Du Bois. Morbus nigrans, J. Elric. Fever, Black Death, madness. Names, dates, and something even more chilling. The word failed. The cellar reeked of iron and mold, and under the wooden floorboards, Lucien found the edge of a hatch. It took both of them to lift it, and even then, the creak of the hinges sent a chill through Elena's spine. Beneath the trapdoor was a staircase carved directly into the earth. At the bottom was a corridor that looked like it had been cut centuries ago. Torches once lit the way, but now only damp silence filled the air. The walls were etched with symbols, alchemical, astrological, and some that neither of them could recognize. It was like entering the subconscious of a dying age, where belief and fear blurred together into something far more dangerous. "This is where it happened," Elena whispered. "The real medicine, the forbidden kind." Further down the passage, they came upon a small chamber. Inside was a wooden table, still intact, and a series of scrolls bound in human skin. Lucien recoiled, his face pale. It's ritualistic. This isn't science." But Elena wasn't convinced. It's both. This was their research lab and their temple. They believed illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. They weren't healing people. They were trying to separate the sickness from the soul. She lit a second candle and walked over to the far end of the chamber, where a sealed door sat nearly hidden in the shadows. On it was carved a phrase in Old French, "Ce que garissent any dormant jamais." Those who heal never sleep. "Help me," she said. Together, they forced it open. What lay beyond made them both step back. Rows of stone beds, or were they altars, lined a circular room. Bones, shackles, and rusted instruments littered the ground. Above, a domed ceiling had a hole in the center, likely once used to lower things, or people, into the chamber. On the wall was a fresco, almost perfectly preserved, showing a physician in plague mask garb standing over a patient. But instead of healing him, the man appeared to be extracting something from the body, a dark vapor, curling like smoke, with faces trapped inside. Lucien's voice trembled. They weren't just treating disease. They thought they could remove evil. Or harvest it, Elena added. It was then she spotted something half-buried near the center altar. A small wooden box, locked with iron bands and etched with the same seal as her grandfather's journal. With hands steadier than she expected, Elena opened it. Inside was a vial, sealed tight, darkened from within, but glowing faintly as if something pulsed inside it. Next to it was a letter in the same familiar handwriting. "If you have found this, then I've failed, but must not be used. Not ever. The soul cannot be separated without cost. Medicine that ignores pain will become its servant." Lucien leaned over, staring at the vial. "Do you feel that?" Elena nodded. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. It was like standing near a thunderstorm. She closed the box. They left the chamber in silence, sealing the trapdoor behind them, unsure of whether it was to protect the world from what was inside, or vice versa. Back in the village, things had changed. The sickness that had plagued the region for weeks had suddenly worsened. More people were bedridden, and the local doctor, a modern man who had once laughed at herbal cures, was desperate. Rumors had begun to spread that the new strangers in the old cottage had brought something with them. Something ancient. One night, as the wind howled and thunder cracked across the sky, Elena stood at the window, holding the vial. Her reflection looked back at her, older somehow, more burdened. She knew what people were thinking. She knew the fear they felt, because part of her felt it too. Lucien walked in. "We could take it to the university. Let them test it. Keep it safe." Elena looked at him. "Or ends up on a shelf, next to other forgotten relics. Or worse, someone tries to use it." He stepped closer. "So what do we do?" Her hand tightened around the box. "We finish what my grandfather couldn't." The next morning, they returned to the underground chamber with torches, iron tools, and a plan. Elena placed the box on the center altar, whispered something she wasn't sure was a prayer or a warning, and stepped back. Lucien lit the circle of salts and herbs they had prepared, just as the old books described, not out of belief, but out of caution. As the flames rose and the air thickened, a low sound began to fill the chamber. Not a wind, not a voice, something in between. Elena opened the box, and then the ground shook. But before she could see what came out, before she could even blink, the lights went out, and everything was swallowed in silence. And above ground, in the quiet village that had long forgotten the true cost of medicine, the church bells began to ring on their own. Something had returned, and it was waiting. The wind howled through the rafters of the infirmary as the monks gathered around the fire, their eyes hollow from the night's events. Father Theobald hadn't spoken a word since the young boy's fever broke suddenly and violently, as if expelled by something unnatural. The mysterious herbs brought in by the herbalist, Marjorie, still simmered in the pot, but nobody dared touch it again. The child, Henry, had survived, but not without cost. His body trembled as if something remained inside him, something ancient and unseen. Outside, Marjorie sat alone on the stone bench, watching the moon pass behind a shroud of clouds. The entire abbey had been disturbed by what happened in the chapel, but she seemed almost too calm, like she had seen it all before. Brother Alric approached quietly, not sure whether to thank her or question her. He chose silence, sitting beside her and waiting for her to speak. "They don't understand the sickness," Marjorie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. They treat it like a punishment or a curse. But this land, it remembers things we've long forgotten. And it's not kind when disturbed. Brother Alric frowned. You think this is something old? Older than the fever? She nodded. Older than the church. Older than the name of this village. The plants that grew in the hollows of that hill, they don't bloom like that without reason. Something stirred them awake. Inside the abbey, the prior and senior monks debated what had gone wrong. Brother Oswin, still shaken, suggested that the devil's hand was involved, while Father Theobald remained unusually silent. He was staring at the old texts Marjorie had briefly consulted. They were copies of even older works, some medical, others borderline heretical in the eyes of the church. Yet, one page was marked with a ribbon, a passage describing a ritual once used by ancient hill folk to draw out evil humors, not just from the body, but the soul. The tension grew in the days that followed. More villagers began falling ill, but the symptoms were not consistent. Some suffered high fevers and delirium. Others saw visions and spoke in tongues. A few vanished into the woods and were later found kneeling at old stones, mouths full of dirt, eyes wide open but unseeing. Fear took root faster than the sickness. Whispers of witchcraft spread like wildfire. The herbalist Marjorie became both savior and suspect. Some villagers swore she had healed them with her teas. Others claimed they saw her talking to shadows near the edge of the woods at night. The tension between the church and the old ways that had been silently tolerated for years suddenly broke into the open. Brother Alric found himself torn. He'd seen Marjorie's knowledge help the sick, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she revealed. He began searching through the abbey's older scrolls at night, cross-referencing the herbal entries with the symptoms they were seeing. The deeper he went, the more he found mentions of ancient spirits, seasonal awakenings, and mysterious outbreaks linked to land that had once been used for pre-Christian rituals. One entry chilled him. It spoke of a region near their village that had once been known as Wormwood, said to be the resting place of forgotten gods. The people who once lived there believed illness was a form of spiritual hunger, something that needed to be fed or pacified. The very plants Marjorie had used were listed among the offerings once burned during these rites. Brother Alric brought this to Father Theobald. The old priest listened carefully, saying little, his face pale. At last, he said, "We have woken something. Whether it be by ignorance or arrogance, I do not know. But we must finish what we started, or it will not stop." Marjorie returned that evening, summoned to the abbey not by request, but by fear. A child had collapsed near the well, foaming at the mouth. A dozen villagers surrounded the infirmary, demanding answers. The boy's skin had gone ash-gray, his breath shallow and strange. None of the usual medicines worked. Inside the chapel, the child convulsed. Brother Oswin screamed that it was possession, that they needed an exorcism. But Marjorie pushed forward with a small leather pouch, pulled out a dried, thorny root, and whispered a chant under her breath. The monks stood frozen as she held it to the boy's lips. Moments passed. Then, the child exhaled deeply and fell into sleep. "You've seen this before," Brother Alric said quietly afterward, confronting her in the corridor. Marjorie didn't deny it. "I've seen what happens when the land is disturbed, when the cycle is broken. There are things buried deep in this soil, and not all of them are dead." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You believe it's not a plague, don't you?" "No," she whispered. "It's a warning." The final twist came later that night. Brother Oswin, furious and frightened, led a group of villagers to Marjorie's home at the forest's edge. They meant to drive her out, accuse her publicly, maybe worse. But when they arrived, the house was empty. No fire, no food, no herbs, only a torn parchment laid on the floor. Brother Alric arrived minutes later, having followed them. He picked up the parchment and read the ink-smudged words. "It's not me they want. It's balance. And now that balance has shifted, it will find another way." As thunder rolled across the valley, a deep tremor passed through the earth, shaking the foundations of the abbey and sending birds scattering from the trees. In the distance, the faint howl of wolves echoed from the hills, though no wolf had been seen in the region for 100 years. The monks prayed until morning. In the days that followed, the illness faded, but not entirely. Some of those who'd recovered began to change. Their sleep was plagued with strange dreams, and their skin bore markings they couldn't explain. A low hum could be heard at night from the woods, faint but steady. The well water grew cold and metallic. Livestock refused to drink from it. Brother Auric kept Marjorie's books hidden. He reread her notes, comparing them to the old scrolls. The patterns were undeniable. Every few generations, something stirred. A sickness, yes, but not one of the body alone. It came when the balance tipped too far, when greed, war, or religion pushed too hard against the natural rhythms. And each time, it chose a vessel. As he looked out over the fields, where fog now lingered long past dawn, he wondered who it would choose next. And then he heard it again, that hum, low and rising, coming not from the woods this time, but from the abbey's very walls. The story was not over, not even close. The final days of Brother Auric's life were quiet, spent tending the monastery garden and writing long, careful notes about everything he'd learned, not just from the ancient texts he once believed held all the answers, but from the people around him. Father Everard, no longer holding the same harsh grip on the infirmary, had passed his role on to someone younger. Brother Martin, who believed in healing not just through prayer, but with reason, observation, and even herbs proven by trial. It was a new era in a very old place, and the walls of the abbey, once echoing with coughing and whispered prayers of the dying, now held more laughter and open conversation. People from a nearby village came more freely now, not just to be treated, but to share remedies passed down from their grandmothers, to bring herbs they'd grown or mushrooms they'd foraged. The monks were finally listening. They no longer mocked the midwives or the old women with strange ointments and stories. They wrote things down. They tested. They learned. It wasn't modern medicine, not yet, but it was a turn in the road, one that didn't lead straight into darkness. Eleanor, the wise woman who had once hidden her skills, was now welcomed as a teacher. She came to the abbey once a month, her sharp tongue tempered by age and purpose. She spoke to young monks about how willow bark could ease fever and how too much nightshade could kill. She taught about balance, between healing and harm, between faith and reason. Auric once asked her, as they walked along the edge of the woods, whether she ever missed the quiet life before anyone believed in her knowledge. She only smiled and said, "I miss nothing. Every story told, every life saved, every truth shared is a step away from the shadows." The whispers about the Queen's healer faded, too. Stories of dark rituals and vanished patients gave way to a more truthful memory, that desperate people had once done desperate things, and not every person with power had used it wisely. The court no longer demanded strange concoctions in gold-trimmed vials. The new king's physicians were learning to wash their hands, to boil their tools, to listen more than they talked. It was slow. Change always was. But it had begun. At the village's edge, a small stone marker stood in the earth where the old pest house once was. Auric had placed it there before his hands grew too weak. It read only, asterisk for the forgotten. May their pain teach us still. Asterisk people left herbs there sometimes, or lit candles. A midwife placed a sprig of yarrow beneath the stone one night and whispered thanks. A young boy who had once been turned away by a fearful monk came with his mother, now healthy, and they stood in silence. Healing had come, not just to bodies, but to memories. One of the most surprising changes was in the way people began to talk. They no longer whispered about their fears of illness or hid their deformities. They shared. They compared. They asked questions. Illness no longer carried the same shame it once had. Pain was no longer a sin, but something to be understood and soothed. The church still spoke of miracles, but it didn't punish those who sought practical help. And the word medicine no longer made the villagers flinch. At the heart of the story was the simple truth that kept echoing through Auric's notes and teachings. Medicine, in its earliest form, was not just about herbs or surgery or scripture. It was about people, the ones who cared, the ones who noticed what worked and what didn't. The ones who dare to ask why, even when the world punished them for it. In one of his last entries, Brother Alaric had written, "We feared the plague more than we understood it. We called madness a curse. We bled the sick and called it mercy. But now we learn. One honest healer, one curious soul, one person who dares to ask, is worth more than 100 old books. Let them burn. Let truth grow in their ashes." As his candle burned low one night, with parchment still beneath his hand, Alaric finally closed his eyes. The abbey bells didn't ring out in mourning, only in quiet respect. His notes were kept, copied, shared with other monasteries. Some were laughed at, others adopted, but none were thrown away. Decades later, long after the abbey itself fell to ruin, a physician in a bustling city came across one of Alaric's old writings. It was tucked in a stack of forgotten pages, stained with time. The physician read it once, then again, then copied it down in his own neat script. He wrote in the margins, "First record of herbal patient observation, remarkably advanced." He didn't know the whole story. He didn't know about the shadows behind the monastery walls, or the woman with the green eyes, or the plague cart in the snow. But he knew that the words mattered, that they had come from someone who had tried, failed, questioned, and still kept learning. And that was enough. The legacy of medieval medicine wasn't just bloodletting or leeches or prayers whispered in Latin. It was the resilience of people, the ones who survived in spite of it, the ones who taught others even when no one would listen, the ones who made mistakes but still moved forward, and most of all, those who kept seeking light in an age of darkness. Even in the most forgotten corners of history, where the night feels longest and the truth is hidden behind superstition and fear, there are always moments of hope. A pair of hands bandaging a wound with care, a voice asking a better question, a child saved not by miracle, but by someone paying attention. That's what remains, long after the plagues end and the kings are buried. Not the rituals, not the punishments, but the people who dare to care. And maybe, just maybe, one day someone will look back on us, on our mistakes, our breakthroughs, our stubborn belief that we know everything, and see the same flicker of humanity struggling through the dark, trying to find a better way.